Welcome to the Digital Revolution 2.0 here on YouTube, and today is Film Friday. What does that mean? Well, Eve and I, hi Eve.
Hello.
We're going to talk about an artwork that we made and a movie that we made, A Wonderful Plague, our award-winning film, and we're going to talk just briefly about the camera that we used to make the work, the film that we shot it on, and then you're going to get to see the movie here.
Yay!
Yay! Okay, so A Wonderful Plague was made right when the pandemic was starting. Like literally everything was just shutting down, and I decided that I wanted to go to Provincetown in Cape Cod and create this artwork that was going to look at the pandemic that was up and coming and the idea of...
I want to say this was March of 2020.
Yeah.
It was Friday the 13th. Everything was shutting down. Everything was getting weird and very unpredictable.
Yeah.
And you said, I need to address this. I've always wanted to photograph this cemetery. Well, not a cemetery. It's a burial site.
It's where the pest house was for smallpox victims out in Provincetown. It's
and what better time to photograph it than when we are in the very initial stages of our very own pandemic.
Right. So I had recently at that time just purchased a Photoman 6x24. So this is a massive, massive, well-built camera. If you look at the size that the negative is, it's just huge. And it's a very well-built camera, by the way. The Photoman cameras, I'm really impressed. This is just a block of metal. Very simple, it has a helical focusing mount, and this has a Schneider 90mm XL lens. So it's wicked wide angle. And everything I do with this camera, for the most part, is done handheld, whether it's vertical or horizontal. Eve, you can hold it once. It's so heavy.
Yeah.
I have a...
Is this the heaviest camera you have?
Oh, not even close.
Is this the largest camera you have?
Not even close. But it's
the largest negative.
Not even close.
Really?
No, I have stupider cameras. On the top, I have a Photoman rangefinder, which is really great. It allows you to get your distance and then lock it in on the helical focusing mount, and then shoot. It's really a great camera. On a roll of 120, here I have some 400 TX, you only get 3 frames. So you don't get a whole lot of shots on a roll, but that's okay. It's funny too, because when I was in Cape Cod, when we were first making the artwork, I was down by the water on these rocks right where the pilgrims had landed, like pretty much the same area. And I slipped and slammed my body into the rocks. And the camera hit a rock like this as well. That's what that little tiny scratch is.
Ah, look at that.
Yeah, the camera's got a little tiny scratch in the back. I was laying
there
there
thinking...
thinking...
memento.
Well, I thought I was going to die. It hurt so bad.
And you were all alone.
All alone. I'm laying,
everything's closed.
And there's no cell service here. Everything's closed. And I'm like, oh, great. The tide's coming in. And I'm going to die. What's interesting about this camera, too, is you load it. Most 120 cameras, the film goes on the left side and the take-up spool is on the right side. This camera is the opposite. The film goes here
that
and the
would freak
take-up
me
here.
out.
Well, I was screwing it up at first. It's on the back. It has indications that you advance to frame 3, 7, and 11. But that doesn't work if you load the film and go this way. It only works if you load the film and go this way. It's really weird because of where the window is on the back. The other thing that's neat too is that you can advance and rewind the film back and forth, numbers wise. And so when you've got the film in there, you can actually twist it and pull it against itself. So the film is really flat. So everything about this camera construction wise really is pretty incredible. There's nothing I don't like about this camera. The helical focusing mount is really great. And it's very smooth. And they give you a couple different methods for calibrating the lens, whether you want to use it at infinity or do a field curvature. There's all sorts of different ways of calibrating the focus on the lens. But overall, as I said, I'm really impressed with this camera. So in the movie, the film that I used for it was 400 TX. Tri-X. It would have been processed in D76 1:1 because that's what I was doing back then.
This is the film that created the prints that are in the artwork.
Exactly. So the movie idea is something that Eve and I came up with
as a result of the pandemic.
As a result of the pandemic. How could we share our artworks to an audience when everything was closed?
When nobody can come inside, nobody wants to be anywhere in person, and so we thought, well, we can take our artwork and we will do a guided tour of the work
right.
with the film.
And so in most of our films, and we'll be doing this hopefully more often, there is a discussion of us making the artwork as well. Like I talk about going to the smallpox cemetery. I've got some B-roll of me being there. You were on the floor writing on the pieces. And it's a very large artwork.
So this is the very first one of these that we did, correct?
It is.
Yeah.
And I think as we are now hopefully exiting the big chunk of the pandemic and COVID becomes just part of something endemic, that I think this artwork is very relevant now, and I think it's something that we all should be reflecting upon, that plague is very much a part of
the human condition.
Yeah, since the beginning of time. So I guess without any more of us talking, does you want to say anything else?
Nope.
Okay, so here it is.
Enjoy.
A Wonderful Plague.
The 7 bowls are a set of plagues mentioned in Revelation 16. They are recorded as apocalyptic events that were seen in the vision of the revelation of Jesus Christ by John of Patmos. 7 angels are given 7 bowls of God's wrath, each consisting of judgments. These 7 bowls of God's wrath are poured out on the wicked and the followers of the Antichrist after the sounding of the 7 trumpets. Rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals. Risk groups were first identified as the 4 H's: hemophiliacs, heroin addicts, homosexuals, and Haitians. Another unfounded hypothesis accused the government of creating the pathogen to eradicate the gay and African American communities. The concept of disease is never innocent. Susan Sontag. Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, the first Native American to be canonized, had smallpox as a child. It killed her family and left her with poor vision and pockmarks on her face. After her conversion to Catholicism, she took a vow of chastity and practiced ordered suffering, such as self-flagellation and sleeping on a mat of thorns. Upon her death at the age of 24, it is said her smallpox scars magically vanished and her face became white. Black Death, bubonic plague, 200 million. Smallpox, 56 million. Spanish flu, 40 to 50 million. Plague of Justinian, 30 to 50 million. HIV/AIDS, 25 to 35 million. As of April 17th, 2020, COVID-19, 146,000.
I've always wanted to visit the smallpox cemetery on the outskirts of Provincetown in Cape Cod. I've been going to Cape Cod for well over 20 years to make artwork, and given our current pandemic, I figured this was the perfect time to go. I knew if I went now to Cape Cod, I would have the energy of the fear of the current pandemic, the sense of isolation, and all of that would be important in the creation of the artwork. So I drove out to Cape Cod and I was able to find the cemetery, and I tell you, it's a humbling experience. It was a wet day, it was raining, it was cold, very gray. And when I first saw the first marker of the smallpox victim looking down a hillside, it was shocking. It was very lonely, and you could get a sense of what type of isolation this would be. Spending time down there, walking around, and then finding the foundation ruins of the pest house, you really got a sense of what the terror must have been like being removed. And it sort of puts into context a lot of what we're all feeling today in terms of being separated from family and friends while we all endure our own isolation.
Here there be monsters. Inscribed on a series of markers, far out in the marsh, there are numbers instead of names. You probably won't find it. It was considered remote in the days of quarantine, but now the place is a ghost of a ghost. Grown over by brambles and bracken, there are only a few stones still sticking up, forgotten reminders that to ail was to be sent away from home in shame, disgrace, and panic. Sent to a shack in the swamp that measured 8 by 10 feet and was occupied by the soon to be dead. They called it the pest house. I leave pennies for them in remembrance. Adam Dyer, laborer, age 22. John Roberts, age unknown. Monson W. Barnard, age unknown. Elizabeth Hill, wife, age 51. Kenneth Ferguson, mariner, age 22. Anton Domingo, mariner, age 22. Mary Rogers, widow, age 25. George G. Hallett, carpenter, age 31 years and 9 months. Tamson Manuel, wife, age 73 years and 29 days. Frank Sofrene, age unknown. Manuel Terceria, age unknown. William H. Butler, age unknown. John A. McDonald, age unknown. Thomas Bussell, age unknown. So when Steve and I work together, he often will come up with a place that he's interested in photographing, both for reasons visual, but also the meaning of the place or the history. And so he'd been talking for some time about wanting to photograph in Cape Cod, and very specifically the smallpox cemetery, which he had been looking for. And when the coronavirus started to become very much a concern, and everyone's talking about it, he was drawn more and more to the idea of going and photographing in Cape Cod for a specific piece about the pandemic. And there were really three threads of thought involved there. And so there are really three image scenes depicted in the piece, in the 6 panels of the piece. One of them has to do with the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower, which is this year, and concerning the idea of the pilgrims and the bringing of European disease to the Native Americans. Then, of course, we have smallpox, which has to do with the smallpox cemetery and the pest house. And the third thread of thought running throughout the piece is HIV/AIDS and the epidemic that would have hit gay communities, predominantly gay communities such as Provincetown, especially hard. So Steve took these images, and then I proceeded to do research about the history of pandemics and the history of diseases. And I found a lot of common threads that came up over and over again. The idea of the scapegoat, the idea of power, who's in charge, who benefits from the pandemic, who are the winners and who are the losers. Other themes that come up in both the history of pandemics as well as in the piece are themes of denial and isolation, of fear, and in particular, fear of the other or the contaminated. And often those two things are conflated one with the other. But there's also a very harmonious aspect to the piece. And I feel like that speaks to the commonality of the human experience. You know, there's a lot of unpleasantness in this work, but in the end, it's still a very beautiful experience. It talks about what it means to be human. When we talk about the pieces, I frequently like to think of it as Steve is creating the silent movie. And then when I introduce the text and inscribe it on the surface of each print by hand, I'm adding the soundtrack. And what I love is watching viewers engage with pieces, because it's a relationship that changes as they get closer to the piece and they start to realize there's text to read, and then they go engage with the piece up, down, around. They stand closer, they back up. It's a very dynamic, interesting relationship with the viewer. And I spend a lot of time working on inscribing all of the text into the piece, trying to work it in this relationship with the imagery. When the Pilgrims arrived in Cape Cod, they were amazed to find a deserted Native American village with a sweet brook and plowed fields for corn. Even though they had arrived at this location by mistake, they had been expecting to arrive in Virginia. They took it as a sign of divine providence that God wanted them to settle here. What they could not have known was that the previous residents, the Wampanoag, had been decimated by European disease even before the Pilgrims' arrival, due to the presence of European whale hunters, fishermen, fur traders, and explorers, and more specifically, the rats on board their ships. Europeans had a lifetime of exposure to such viruses, but the native population was extremely vulnerable. As many as 90% of Native Americans died from such diseases as smallpox, leptospirosis, and measles. But why didn't the opposite also occur? Why weren't Europeans also introduced to new diseases by the Native Americans? Perhaps they were. A disease for which there is arguably no evidence in Europe until after the return of Columbus? Syphilis. Isolation is my closest companion. I am a million miles out at sea, and there is no one to hear me, no one to help me. Go ahead and scream if you like. No one is here to care. No one to wonder how I am or what I want for dinner. No one to tuck me in, or sing to me, or need me. I owe nothing, own nothing, am nothing. Do I even exist when I am in seclusion? My greatest fear is not of dying, but of dying alone. Squanto's unique knowledge of the English language and English ways gave him power. He sought to increase his status among other native groups by exaggerating his influence with the colonists, and even going so far as to tell them that if they didn't do what he wanted, he could have the English release the plague, which he claimed they were holding in storage pits. Saint Corona used to be the patron saint of lumberjacks and treasure hunting, but in the age of coronavirus, her name is being invoked for protection from pandemics. The story goes that during the 2nd century, a Roman soldier named Victor was being tortured for his Christian faith, eyes gouged out with a poker, the usual. And the 16-year-old wife of another soldier comforted him. As punishment for this offense, she was tied between 2 palm trees that had been bent to the ground. When they were let go, she was torn in half. She is named Saint Corona due to a reported vision she had of 2 crowns, one for herself and one for Victor. Today, her remains lie in the cathedral at Aachen, Germany, although it is also said they are in Anzou, Italy. Or perhaps there is some of her in both places, assuming, of course, that she ever existed at all.
There is nothing particularly novel about a plague. Outbreaks of disease have occurred since the beginning of civilization, and the technical manifestations of such events are well understood and documented. Plague is as much a part of humanity as agriculture, religion, and art. A plague just isn't a plague, though. Invariably, as disease makes its way through a community, it takes on all sorts of meanings, connotations, and implications. Nothing brings out the humanity of people like a good plague. One would think the language of plague to the scientifically minded is specific and matter of fact, but it is not. We call it the AIDS epidemic, not the more accurate HIV pandemic, because we see the people who suffer the disease as other. Meaning, because AIDS isn't impacting our community or the general population, we need not be concerned about it as a whole. In North America and Europe, COVID-19 is the first plague many people are experiencing. In press conferences and on social media, one hears the sentiment, nobody has seen this before. And yet for queer men, plague has been our reality since July 3rd, 1981, when the New York Times reported a rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals. Gay cancer became the idea of the disease. It remained that way officially until the fall of the following year, when the CDC used the term AIDS to describe the disease. In his seminal 1949 work, The Science of Culture, anthropologist Leslie White argues, science is one of 2 basic ways of dealing with experience. The purpose of science and art is one, to render experience intelligible, that is, to assist man to adjust himself to his environment in order that he may live. Leslie White's sentiment is never more true and more urgent than in the time of plague. Death comes for all souls, kings and slaves alike. No amount of money or privilege or magical thinking can protect you. And yet, the greater burden is almost always borne by those whom society was failing before the plague. Systems that were failing fail. Cold animosities become hot. Those on the margins are cast out. You can prepare and protect yourself, but even if yourself is spared, those around you are not. This is what makes plagues uniquely terrifying, irrational, and nonsensical. And this is why we turn to art in these times, to make sense of it all. How we will live with the plague, how we will live differently, is shaped by how we understand the plague in the first place. That is what art can teach us.
I read somewhere that modern medicine creates the illusion of immortality. Surely this was intended as a criticism, but lately I've been wondering, is that necessarily such a bad thing? A fairy tale, yes, but no worse or better than the one European doctors told themselves when they donned their bird of death costumes, smothering themselves in mint and lavender rather than detect the stink of bubonic plague patients burning in their own bodies. They deluded themselves then to think it made them safe, not unlike how we delude ourselves now. Doesn't every generation conceive of its own unique defense against the horrors of life? How can we expect to function without the illusion of immortality? Denial is very useful. Everywhere today, people talk about the new normal, another agreed upon lie, that there is such a thing as normal. And further, that if there were, who's to say that we'd have any right to it at all? Nothing stays. Nothing is permanent. Life does not come with a money-back guarantee. We just think it should. If we all hold our breaths long enough to prove our faith, will the lie become true? The thing that was coming for him was unnamed and unnameable, looming in the back of his consciousness like the darkness behind a door. It woke him in the middle of the night in a sweat, heart racing from terror. By God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague. Ah, yes, wonderful. Here's a neat riddle. When is a plague not a plague? When it wipes out your enemies. A plague can be lovable if specially designed by the universe to erase those who frighten you, threaten you, call into question the very nature of your legitimate existence. Or maybe they just happen to be the owners of something you covet. Their deaths are thereby sanctioned, aren't they? Proof that your way of life is the right one, because the dead brought it on themselves through the cardinal sin of difference. God hates them.